I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source with Mark Blyth, the celebrated Scots-accented people's economist. Celebrated above all, Mark, when you come home to the locals in your own old pub in Dundee and settle all the arguments there are around money and power. Populism on the way to plutocracy in the comeback reign of Donald Trump. Welcome back. People ask for you, Mark. You have a following in our listenership. Before we get to Trump 2, just speak of, for me, the lingering Biden paradox. The economy was said to be the saving grace of Joe Biden's short term, specifically the drive to rebuild the industrial base at home. But the same economy was the undoing of his would-be successor, Kamala Harris, specifically inflation, a largely hidden cost of living crisis in food and energy that hurt real people, poor people, most of all. What is your final score on Bidenomics, Mark?
Well, first of all, hi, Chris. It's nice to see you again. And hello, everyone. And it's nice to know that one wants one back on the show. So that's good.
They do.
So let's separate out a few things here, right? Bidenomics, right? If we mean by that the IRA, not the Irish Republican Army, we know, right? So, the core of Bidenomics was the Inflation Reduction Act. And a good comparison to this is, and I got this from Paul Pearson, the political scientist, I thought it was a good way of putting it, is Obamacare. When Obamacare came in, it was fragile. Nobody liked it. Nobody understood it. Nobody knew what it was for. But then you wait 5, 6, 7 years, and 20 million people are getting healthcare they didn't have before, and you can't touch that. And what happened was, if Biden's successor had managed to actually win, you would have got IRA 2, and it would have embedded it, and it would have expanded it, and it would have done more on labor and mobility and skills. And then if they'd won again on the back of that, you would have got IRA 3, and then it would have transformed. And that would have been a game changer because you would have hundreds of thousands of people in different Republican pockets of states now into the green economy. The gamble didn't work. The other side of it is the bit they couldn't control. Basically, global inflation taking off because of the pandemic and then because of the energy shocks. Could they have done a better job with that? Well, everyone across the world actually blames the government, but the government years ago, Chris, gave all responsibility for such things to the central banks. And the central banks only have two tools. When things are going south, deflation, you buy and sell assets, quantitative easing, remember all that stuff. And then when things are going north, prices are going up, you jack up interest rates. That's what you do. So when you do that, you end up hurting people disproportionately across the income distribution. If you're at the bad end of the income distribution, you already live on shitty credit. You already pay twice as much as somebody who's at the top end for a credit card if you can get one. You're already doing payday loans. This is all the stuff that when you push up interest rates, your stuff goes screamingly high. Meanwhile, if you're at the other end of the income distribution, let me give you a great statistic from a paper from researchers at UMass.
Yeah, please.
In 2022, U.S. carbon firms, basically carbon majors, oil companies, etc., made $220 billion in extra profits because of the inflation. 50% of those profits went to the top 1% of households in the form of direct share ownership or dividends, which means over $100 billion went to 1% of the population to more than offset any inflation that they suffered and gave them a capital gain. Meanwhile, at the bottom, everyone else is struggling with the gas prices and the high credit costs. Now let's think about why people are annoyed. It's really quite simple. There's a huge disconnect between the project of the IRA and what derailed it, which was an inflation that was felt asymmetrically across the income distribution.
Wow. Explain that a little bit. Inflation that fell asymmetrically across the population.
What I was trying to say there, Chris, was you got these people at the top who, when they're basically taking their shares and dividends from the carbon companies that are making money hand over fist, they're making money in inflation. At the other end of the income distribution, they're the people who are the price takers of the higher food costs, the higher energy costs, and the higher credit costs. That's the asymmetry.
Okay. But of course, we didn't get the IRA 2, 3, 4, etc. Not only that, but Donald Trump won the working class vote.
Yeah, of course he did.
And Kamala Harris won the professional class.
Even better than that, if you earn over $100,000 a year, you vote Democrat. If you don't, you don't. It's kind of straightforward now.
Straightforwardly upside down.
But Chris, when did the Democrats actually, in your lifetime, please tell me, the last time the Democrats championed working class issues of redistribution, right, of security of jobs, of unions. Biden's the first guy who's come in and done this in forever. The Clinton Democrats, Obama, everything was just for the corporations. People remember this.
Yeah. I'm old enough to remember Hubert Humphrey, who didn't get to be president, but John F. Kennedy, who surely was a union kind of guy, Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's how far we have to go back. With the one exception was Biden, and Biden's attempt to do this was derailed by inflation.
What do we have to know now about Trumponomics? What can we say we know? Trump likes to say tariffs is the most beautiful word in the English language, and with the deportation of millions of illegal immigrants, he's going to have a revenue windfall, he's going to build industry and solid jobs, and somehow contain inflation. How much of that can you believe?
I can believe some of it because I think that basically we have a playbook for how things are meant to work, which hasn't been true for a long time. Remember, banks were meant to be the best judges of risk. Remember that corporations were meant to be the best judges of value, etc., etc. So maybe we've got something wrong on tariffs. So what might this be? Well, there was disaster music played the last time tariffs were brought up and nothing happened. Biden kept up all of Trump's tariffs and actually extended more and more of them against China. Nothing much seemed to happen. So the Trump playbook on this one is something that paradoxically used to be a goal of the left, which is global rebalancing. The problem is you've got too many exporters in the world all trying to sell to the one market that does the imports, which is us. And if we keep doing the imports, you eventually hollow it out, so you got nothing left except Walmart on one side, Amazon warehouse on another, and the Federal Reserve printing dollars to pay for it. If you want to stop that, there are various ways you could do it, but one way you could do it is to shove up big tariffs. Then all the export countries have to basically eat their own surplus. That rebalances, and that gives you breathing space to rebuild industry. Now, the wrinkle in this is the immigration stuff, because the way that they like to tell the story is, all right, then when we get rid of all these illegals, that'll tighten labour markets even further. That'll push up wages. That'll be good for the working class. The only way that employers who have to stay in America now, because we've got these tariffs up, can pay for this is if they invest in productivity enhancement that'll pay for the wages. And that's how we create a virtuous circle. That is really hard to do and one hell of a bet, particularly because without immigrants, your population is going to shrink. And your population is going to get old. And you're going to have less and less workers that are going to be more and more vulnerable to being replaced by technology. Oh, and look who the big backers of this movement are. It's the tech companies. Do you think there could be a connection there, Chris?
Explain it for me. I'm still trying to remember what we as schoolboys learned to hate about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that led us to World War. But remind me.
Well, I mean, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, in my opinion, that story has been overdone for years. The global economy was in depression whilst the Smoot-Hawley tariffs happened. It's a bit like, my body's on fire and I decided to hack off my hand. Hacking off my hand wasn't really the problem, although it didn't help. So, the tariffs were part of it. They dragged the 1930s down further into deflation, but it was already a case of the shit hitting the fan before Smoot-Hawley ever happened. We hate tariffs because they're basically an inefficiency and because what they are is a tax on somebody else. And what then happens, and this is the real danger of tariffs, is you get reprisals. So you put up 20% tax, they put up 20%. You put up 30, you put up 30. All you've basically done is made each other poorer because you're shoveling money around that has no purpose. I'm taxing you, you're taxing me, and the overall volume of trade goes down. That means jobs go down, etc., etc. So there's good reasons to be afraid of this, but what basically has happened under the past two administrations is the United States has turned away from that model and said, let's use tariffs either to build a green industry, which was the Biden one, or alternative, what we're seeing now is to basically make the exporters rebalance, which is essentially what's going on with the Trump side.
Okay. I have a different sort of question I want to put to you, Mark. Broad and vaguely philosophical, but it's about both politics and economics and basically our identity. A transition underway. I think a line has been crossed. Who are we? Forever we have said that we're the world's proudest democracy, but we're now racing, it seems to me, toward government of, by, and for the very rich, which is called plutocracy, in a word. Trump cabinet of billionaires, $250 million in campaign contributions from one man, Elon Musk. We've got a net worth in the cabinet of $340 billion of personal property, The Guardian reports. It seems to me a line has very brazenly, obviously, clearly been crossed but we haven't begun to account for it to ourselves.
Well, I would say that it's just more public, to be perfectly honest, Chris. I mean, we think about the revolving door that's been going on forever between the Obama administration and Goldman Sachs. We think about the tech companies rotating in and out of the Obama administration. Things changed slightly under Biden, but, basically we've had corporations and business and government in bed together for as long as I can possibly remember. In terms of sort of the oligarchic point, yeah, I think that what you've got now is a bigger scale and it's more brazen and it's more open and the characters are different. So that you're funding by Thiel and then your public face is Musk, etc., etc. You've got the sort of the right-wing lurch of Silicon Valley on this. But I mean, the Obama unofficial cabinet was Eric Schmidt from Google. I mean, they're just reshuffling the pack. They're just being more brazen about it. Are they going to be more brazen in terms of sort of corporate double dealing? You don't even need to do that. It's not as if Musk needs to go get the contracts and stuff like that. The market itself is pricing it in. SpaceX is up 30% because of all the shenanigans that he's done. That's the market just crediting the share price. He doesn't even need to do anything corrupt that even looks like it. So I think all we've done is basically pulled the scab off what America really is, which has basically been a kind of corporate oligarchy with a democracy for tax purposes.
I'm much more used to right-wing, left-wing arguments, whether they're full of merit or not. This is not so much in service of an ideology or a direction of politics. It's in service of money, the payback.
Right.
And some of it, as you say, very personal and utterly blatant.
But at the same time, some of it not. So basically the $30 billion that went on the value of SpaceX and Musk's other companies because of his proximity to Trump. I mean, the market is pricing in the fact that he's going to get all this money. He's also going to get all this money because he's actually able to put rockets in space and Boeing is shit. Right, so that's another reason it happens. So, I don't see this as qualitatively different, really. I mean, I remember before when if you tried to say anything at all about Google's search engine monopoly in the Democratic Party, you were taken outside and shot. So, there's different flavors of the same corruption.
No question that the Democrats, and Barack Obama maybe more than anybody, have been conspicuously seeking out palship and money of all sorts in Silicon Valley. That's not new. Still, the proportion, the sheer size of it is, to me, staggering. I'd love you to talk, though, about some specific things that I barely understand. The crypto bros, for example, heavily invested in Team Trump. The implication is we'll come to a deregulation of financial markets all over the world and a demotion, eventually, of central banks, maybe including our own. Explain that. How is that going to work?
No, that's not going to work. That's all bullshit. Essentially, what these guys are after is one thing, which was to stop the SEC saying that crypto is a currency. Now, you might be confused by that because everyone says it's a currency, and in fact, it's called Bitcoin. But in fact, the proponents are like, no, today it's not a currency. Because if you're a currency, then you become a marketable security. If people are buying this with an expectation of a return, right, then if it's just a currency, it's like the dollar, right? You don't expect a return off the dollar. Oh, hang on, wait a minute. What if I'm a foreign exchange dealer, right? Well, okay, fair enough. Well, what if this thing's more than that? What if it's an asset? Well, why would you say that? Because people take risky punts with it. They go levered on it. They put it in ETFs. If it's an ETF, it's like a stock. So then you need to regulate it. Well, once you do that, you can't do all the sort of hump and dump and hype and all the rest of it that you do that is inherent basically to crypto. So there's a core of crypto, which, in a sense makes sense, which is essentially you want to have some kind of assets in your portfolio that other people find interesting and are willing to buy, even if they have no inherent value. We have that already. It's called gold, right? So think of this as a form of gold. Yeah. You don't want to just be stuck with equities. You don't want to be stuck with bonds. You don't want to be stuck with gold. If all these people out there think this is worth something, I'll have a bit of it as well. That's your simple diversification case for it. Are there other use cases for it? Yeah, you keep hearing about blockchain and all that sort of stuff, but I'll believe that when I see it. The most important thing is everybody who's into this believes it, and because of that, the price goes up. Now, if you've got regulations on that, there's going to be a ceiling on that price. If not, it's going to go down. If you get regulations off of that, woohoo! woo, the price goes right through. And those who are basically funding the donations, etc., are the ones that are sitting with the biggest wallets that are going to make the biggest gains. Now, how does this leave it in global banking deregulation? It doesn't. How does this challenge central banks? In the fantasies of libertarians, perhaps, but in the real world, no. Because what happens is inevitably, when you get this kind of exponential rise in these type of assets, you get yet another crash. So there's another one on the way. It's just a question of when. Then you get a reset, and then they'll do it all again.
You're speaking of it just as an investment, though. Should I put my money into crypto or not? I'm still puzzled about what is the effect of the world paying its bills and making its exchanges in this crypto non-national currency.
So that's slightly different. This is basically ideas like the BRICS currency to have a digital currency that's kind of like, well, then you're doing things like you're pooling the assets, the real assets, the bonds of various different governments. You're putting them in a fund, maybe in Switzerland, and then you're creating a synthetic bond or an instrument called a crypto X, and then people choose to trade in crypto X. That's miles away from Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin isn't used as a currency. Nobody pays anything in Bitcoin. It just doesn't happen. It's purely a speculative asset. The stuff that they're trying to do is actually closer to what central banks have, particularly in China, which is a central bank digital currency. And you know what, Chris? We already have that. Do you have an Apple phone?
I do.
So you know Apple Pay?
Yeah, I don't use it.
Right. Well, basically, it uses dollars, but it's a digital currency. So if you just swapped out dollars for something else, we've already got this tech.
What does that tell me?
It tells you that, don't be seduced by the fact that people are getting very excited about this and they say really crazy things about politics are going to follow from this. They've been saying this since 2008. None of it's happened so far. All they're doing is egging a new speculative frenzy that's going to be 10x more than they paid in donations. Dead easy.
What is the effect on the global economy, balancing the global
Zero.
economy? Let
me tell you why. Remember in 2022 when crypto went to 57 and then went down to 20?
Just barely.
Well, you remember Sam Bankman-Fried?
Of course.
Right. What was the effect on the actual economy of that happening?
Kind of been big.
Zero.
Okay.
So what you've got is a 10x Ponzi scheme. That's it. Good luck with it, lads. If you're in it to win it and you can afford to take the losses, ride the volatility, you'll make a bloody fortune. That's all they want to do.
Take another subject I barely understand, artificial intelligence. The Trump team is generally thought to be favorable to the whole idea with a minimum of regulation and scare talk. They're interested in the science of it, but also, I'm sure, in the huge money interests in it, and they now seem to have given it a green light. Can human intelligence measure what all of that means as an economic shift in our tide and even in our sense of ourselves as the thinkers on Earth, the human implications?
Honestly, Chris, I have no idea about those things because I'm not human.
Finally.
Finally, we admit it. No, all right, the serious point. I don't know about any of that stuff. Nobody knows any of that stuff. Look, again, it's like it's hype. I mean, go back 15 years, right? When the first crypto bust happened. Everyone said, oh, it's not really Bitcoin. It's the blockchain. It's the thing that it's on. And then for the next 10 years, there were conferences all around the world about the blockchain revolution. Never happened, right? 12 years ago, a bunch of guys at Harvard wrote a book called The Race Against the Machine. And it was called Big Data, and big data meets blockchain meets something else. And nobody said the words AI, right? This is when we had Google's Go, beating the Go game and all that sort of stuff. Nobody said the words AI at this point, right? And it was going to change everything, right? No, still waiting. We were all meant to be unemployed by about 2017, according to all those estimates, right? 30% of all jobs are going to go to robots, whatever. None of it happened, right? Now we're putting all this money into certain types of processors, building these huge data centers to house what are called language models, which are essentially sort of like big data meets Google, and it talks back to you in such a way that it sounds kind of like a human, so we all lose our minds and think it's intelligent. It's not. Train it on its own data over 10 iterations, it comes out with gibberish. Right? So it's going to change everything. God, I mean, man, I was 57 years old. If I had £1 for every time I'd heard that, I would be a millionaire. Enough, right?
Don't hesitate to be anti-hype. You are our official antidote to hype, Mark.
And I hope that I'm wrong, because then the world would be a better place, or maybe it won't. So let's imagine I'm completely wrong about this, and then they get to do whatever they want with no guardrails. The analogy that you want to use here is Fukushima. Because what happens is you build a nuclear reactor and you put it on a cliff, and then there's a tsunami and the whole thing goes to shit. And the company that did that in no way can ever internalize the costs that it's just put on everyone else. So if AI is this transformative thing that could gain consciousness and weaponize the world and destroy us all, you should have maximum protocols to protect yourselves on that, because no company that invents this can ever pay the cost if it goes wrong. But if it's all hype, what are they really up to? So let's have a think about this. The most valued company in Silicon Valley just now isn't any of the ones that you've heard that much about. It's one called Palantir. Run by Peter Thiel. It's been basically doing sort of dark work for the Pentagon in AI and related fields for over a decade. There's an offshoot of them that basically does smart drones. What AI is essentially big data and computers and real-time tracking and adaptive learning models that basically weaponizes and robotizes warfare. This is what Ukraine has taught the world. This is what war looks like in the future. All the big tanks and the flashy planes don't matter a shit. This is what you've got to get into if you want to be serious and you want to win. And that is what they're really into.
Come back to one more sort of large block of mysterious danger, and that is the public debt. The annual deficits, the cumulative deficit, even the interest on the federal debt is beyond my imagining now, beyond any pretense of control or even caring. So what?
Yeah, exactly. So what? I thought I disabused you of that bullshit years ago. Are you actually falling victim to this now?
Well, the numbers, and the fact that...
I mean, they're really big numbers, but it's a really big economy. I mean, it doesn't matter what the aggregate number is. It could be like billions or trillions. If the economy is worth 100 trillion, you have 40 trillion in debt, I suppose that's good. If the economy is worth 200 trillion, you have 220 trillion in debt. Is that bad? Well, as a ratio, it's higher, right? I guess. All that matters is people are willing to buy the damn thing because they want the security of holding American assets. So long as that's true, there's no limit. And the people who know this better than anyone else are the Republicans, because they scream about deficits and debts every time the Democrats are in power, and when they're in, they blow them through the roof.
I remember hearing Senator Dirksen say the famous line, a billion here, a billion there. Sooner or later, you're talking about real money. It's all denominated in trillions now, trillion here, trillion there. And I'm happy to ignore the implications if there are any. But then suddenly Germany, the engine of Europe's economy, is said to be in acute distress. The Scholz government is about to fall. Do we hear a warning?
Well, yeah, but that's because they're still trying to sell the world diesel engines at a time when China's moved up the value chain, squeezed them out, and nobody buys their stuff. It has nothing to do with debt. They have the lowest debt in Europe.
Well, I wasn't doing just debt, but I'm talking about good old industrial economic security embodied by Germany all these years.
Which was based upon selling BMWs with diesel engines,
True.
Not just diesel engines, other engines, but basically gasoline products, the car industry, to rich people in China who stopped buying, and rich people in America who basically got squeezed by inflation and stopped buying. And by 15 years of not investing in their own economy because they were so obsessed with balancing the budget, that the trains no longer work, the bridges are falling apart, and wages are low and everyone's miserable. It's really pretty straightforward. If you don't invest in anything, if you don't take any risk, I don't know if you remember this, Chris, what was Merkel's symbol for her second election campaign? It was her standing with her fingers and her thumbs pressed together in the shape of a kind of a heart.
Yes.
And what it symbolized was stability. Stability. You know what stability is called? Death. Nothing's happening. Nothing's changing. And you wait long enough in a stable environment and you wake up dead. That is what's happened.
Mark, what's the hope of hearing a new approach from Donald Trump to the great mystery, some say the great challenge, I say the great potential ally in China?
Interesting question, Chris, because that Trump collective, to the extent that there is one, deeply schismed on this. Very, very much schismed. The Republicans basically are really, really good at fermenting the enemy of the month club. So, the Soviets, whether it was Japan for a while, now it's China, it was Iraq, but that wasn't really serious enough, right? They love to have that external enemy because then you can justify spending and doing all sorts of wicked things to get it done. So China's the bad guy. China is the bad guy in many ways. They've been stealing our tech. They're basically muscling around. They're building an enormous navy. We'd be foolish fools if we weren't paying attention to this. But their correct mode of engagement is interesting because the hawks, the people who really want to, go to war with China and bring down the Communist Party, which is insane, right? They do exist. They're in Congress. They're some of the people around Trump. Trump himself, interesting, right? One of the reasons this guy has a lot of credibility with people is he goes to the states that actually supply the American army. The ones who basically get their limbs blown off, who come back with marginal benefits, no housing support, and end up being fentanyled and homeless. And they're the ones who listen to him when he says, I'm not going to start any wars.
Yeah.
I'm not the guy who's going to go around doing this stuff, right? So once you've said that, right, and he can go from any point to any point. We know this. I'm not looking for consistency. But when you do say that and you set yourself up as somebody who does deals, right? What does he want to do? He wants to do a deal with Putin. He wants to do a deal with Xi. And if tariffs are a means to get there, fine. But it's also possible that it's much deeper than that. That the tariffs are really going to be big. They're going to be on for the long term. And it's about forcing China to change its economic model while we change ours. The jury is out on which version of this we're going to see, but you're right that that's exactly one of the most desperately interesting and also desperately important areas that we're going to be dealing with.
Looking at the Trump prospects in general, Mark Blyth, where would you urge the Democrats to be ready to start a fight?
First of all, by deciding who they want to be when they grow up.
That's important, too.
Because the Democratic Party is not a party, and it has absolutely no direction, no leadership, and no vision. I mean, without that, you're done. I mean, Trump's advantage is Trump has always had a vision. Make America great again. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I mean, make it basically whiter, get rid of immigrants, make it more traditional values, make it more based upon families. Let's roll back the state. You can hate it, but it's a pretty coherent and clear vision, and that's pretty much it. And lots of people sign on to it. What exactly was Kamala's vision?
Oh, remind me. It's 3 weeks now. What was it?
Hey, even if it was 3 weeks.
An opportunity economy. Wasn't that the line?
What does that mean?
I don't know.
Right, exactly. Basically, Henry Farrell, in his really brilliant Substack, which is called Programmable Mutter, did this a couple of weeks ago, where he basically said, look, the core of the Democratic Party are people who think that things are generally okay, that there are some people that are disadvantaged. They tend not to be the working classes. They tend to think about other categories of folks. But, some people are disadvantaged. But by and large, the distribution of wealth and income is probably quite fair. The idea that these people are going to do massive transformations in anything along any category is just a complete mistake. And that's the actual core of the party. The people who run the elections, the people who have the money, and the people who sit in the Senate. You take somebody like AOC, and you put AOC anywhere in a European parliament, she'd be boring centre-left. Here, she's a radical leftist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, come on. And no, she's not a radical leftist because of the Republicans, because of the party she sits with, who literally, their only vision is let's manage things as they are, no matter how dysfunctional they are for how many millions of people, because we at the top 20% are doing fine, and let's not screw this up. We like our 529 plans. We like our little tax advantages. We like the fact that we can send our kids to college that cost $100,000 a year. For everybody else's problems, I don't know, maybe we got a policy for that.
I still turn a little more easily to Bernie Sanders than to AOC. Does he make a difference for you? And what if, this sounds obsessive, but what if the Democrats had embraced Bernie in 2016 as the Republicans were forced to embrace Donald Trump? I mean, wouldn't we have a reasonably productive, solid argument going on about who can do more to make things incrementally better for most Americans?
Well, first of all, remember that the reason that they stabbed him in the back and basically undermined his campaign and promoted Clinton was precisely because he actually wanted to change things. Do you remember what Clinton's campaign was? We're back at 4% unemployment. Everything's great. Hey, Wisconsin, how's it going? I don't know. We've lost on average about $4,000 to $5,000 per head per zip code for the past 20 years. We're doing great, Hillary. How are you? How is Harvard? Bernie was a threat to them. That's why he could never be allowed to succeed. Had he actually run, he might have even beaten Trump. I've actually seen some numbers that suggest that could have been the case.
Yeah.
And if he did, we'd be living in a very different world. But regardless, he would never have got to do it. The Democratic Party would never allow it, and they didn't.
You're right. And the ordinariness of Joe Biden in the end sort of nails the point.
Although what he did, and he'll never get credit for this, he did extraordinary things under incredible constraints. He barely had sort of like time to get started. His own party was against him. Joe Manchin held up everything for a year. He was faced with COVID, and he built the IRA. And if he just hadn't had that inflation to deal with, he might have got over the line. There is his age. The whole thing about the age is absolutely true, and the way the Democrats dealt with that was shameful, right? But nonetheless, if he had come in and said, look, I'm 78 or whatever I am, I'm going to do this. I'm going to basically make sure the next person continues this. This is the plan. This is what we're on. If he wasn't sidelined by COVID and inflation, that could have worked. And he was a transformative president, much more than people are ever going to give him credit for.
Yeah. We're ready for the start of Trump 2, Mark. What is he going to do in the first 6 months to, among other things, deal with the fact that the working class is his base now?
He's going to give them a lot of fun. He's going to defenestrate all the people that have been laughing at them for a long time, at least as far as they're concerned. They're going to go after all the people that put them into seminars on DEI. They're going to go after all the news channels that basically continue to pump, as they see it, Democratic propaganda out. The Democrats, on the other hand, are going to see this as an attack on the press, an attack on civil liberties, and they're going to get circus. Right? Basically, the emperor's going to give them a big circus right at the start. After that, the more serious stuff gets in, and we'll find out if he really is going to do the tariffs, etc., if he's really going to try and rebalance. But what people remember prior to COVID and prior to the inflation was that the bottom 2 quintiles, the 0 to 20%, 20 to 40% of the income distribution, under Trump saw real sustained wage gains for the first time in over 20 years. That's why they like him, right? It was actually getting better. And he was deregulating. He was creating lots of jobs at the bottom. You could say there were jobs that we would like or the jobs that we would take, but there were jobs that were paying, and they were paying more. And people remember that. And then basically it all goes wrong with COVID, which was a disaster. We haven't really begun to even think through how much governments across the world were delegitimated by their handling of COVID. And then on the back of that, how that is weaponized. And then you go into inflation. And people are basically saying, well, when was the last time the eggs were $1.99 rather than $6? Oh, it was when Trump was in.
Are you buying his line that until COVID, he had a marvelous economic success going?
I wouldn't say that he had an economic success going, but I'm saying that what he did was help contribute to an economy that was already doing pretty well. And he did so in a way that has over long term lots and lots of externalities in terms of inequality generation, etc. The tax cuts went all the way to the top, but you got wage growth at the bottom. And that's why people vote for him. So I don't need to accept that he's some kind of economic wonder or anything like this. But it is incumbent, if you want to understand the world, to see it from the point of view of the people who voted for him. They're not stupid. They actually thought that things were better. And for many of them, maybe it was.
Are those low-wage jobs he created in the first term still around, Mark?
Many of them shut down in the pandemic, but many of them bounced back. I mean, one of the things that he did, you may remember this, Chris, he got into a Twitter spat with the head of the Federal Reserve. Remember this? He was bullying him on Twitter. He said, don't you dare raise rates. Because the economy was tearing along at a very crisp pace in 2017. And he was sitting there going, okay, just let it rip. And the Federal Reserve was saying, oh no, we have to worry about inflation, we have to raise rates. And he said, don't you dare raise rates. Run the economy hot. Because if you do that, what's going to happen is you're going to pull more people in the labour market, wages are going to go up. And the people at the Fed were like, oh, we're going to have to raise rates, Turned out they didn't raise rates, and guess what happened? More people got pulled in and wages went up.
What of the general suspicion out there, associated with Elizabeth Warren, obviously, but also with Bernie, that the system is rigged and it's not for us?
Yeah, but they're part of the system. I mean, Bernie possibly accepted it. I know that Elizabeth is, her heart's in the right place and really wants to do these right things. But I mean, we are the system. Like, she's a professor at Harvard, for God's sake. You don't get more system than that. Like, what exactly is sort of the system is rigged? The systems are rigged in such a way that universities have giant endowments, effectively run themselves as hedge funds for tax purposes, or runs a college for tax purposes. They don't pay any taxes on that endowment. If I was a private fund, you'd be paying taxes on it. And then they distribute however they want. That's their system. Is it rigged, or is that just the natural order of things? Right? I'm really sick of this thing where, like, the system is rigged, because each side means something very different from that.
Here's a news item, though, that becomes an interesting test. The murder of Brian Thompson, the insurance executive who got shot in Midtown Manhattan And the question is, why? And what does this represent? Matt Stoller, the monopoly watchdog, had a headline this week saying, an assassin showed just how angry America really is. That's a speculative reading. But the question is, and we all don't know, but what remains of that populist anger that held the stage over the last 10 years and more?
You could say that everyone hates healthcare companies, but that's been true for a very long time. Interestingly, today, two large healthcare companies reversed policy changes, very large-scale policy changes they were going to make. One of them actually was a belter in Connecticut, whereby they were going to limit the time you could be under anesthetic. I think they read the writing on the wall after this, that there's only so much people will take. I guess that's a form of populism.
Mark, look around the world. What's the first test going to be of the wisdom of the election of Donald Trump?
I don't think it's a case of wisdom, Chris. Again,
well, I mean, the choice we made.
Yeah, but again, think about what we say when we say this, right? We have a responsibility to do better than that. Because what you're doing when you're doing that is you're implicitly scolding the people for their choice, right? The wisdom of it, right? That's what we're doing when we're doing this. And part of the reason that we're getting these choices is because our class collectively for the past 30 years has been telling everyone in a very preachy manner what their choice should be. And they've went along with our choices, and they found them to be rather deleterious to their own existence. And now they're no longing to listen to us tell them what to do. So when we say, oh, the deleterious, what's going to be the consequence of your choices, you shameful people, right? Wouldn't it be absolutely amazing if we were completely wrong? Now, I don't think we are. I don't think we're heading into a wonderful time of peace and roses. I can see very bad things happening. He has massive overconfidence in his ability to deal with Putin. What happens to NATO long term? How this leads to instability and the rise of the right in Europe. There's lots of knock-on effect from this election we're just beginning to even smell the consequences of. But in terms of sort of like, it's democracy. What really has begun to frustrate me so much about the American so-called left, which is not left at all, is this idea that sort of like we define the world, we see it as it really is, and if people disagree with us and want something else, there's something wrong with them. The whole point of democracy is that the people make a choice. We're not allowed to veto it. We're not allowed to sanitize it. We can critique it. We can argue about it. But once it's made, you deal with it. And we're just behaving in the worst possible way. We're not Democrats. We're really not. We're defending elite privilege.
We're certainly enjoying elite privilege, Mark. Let's stipulate that right there.
Enjoying may be another way of putting it. Exactly, right. But to go back to it, Chris, right, okay, so what's the downsides here, right? So basically everybody else raises tariffs and everybody loses. What are the other ones? The deportation. You're going to take 12 million people. Right, I mean, it's insane. It's totally nuts, right? And, building these facilities to do this incredibly inhumane thing, which is so... If you were to think about the most anti-American thing you could do, how about the Statue of Liberty's slogan, give me your poor unhandled masses, I'll put them in internment camps and then I'll deport them, right?
Exactly.
It's not exactly what you think of, right? So there's loads of horror that's coming. There's no doubt about it. But whether they'll get to do it or not, we'll have to wait and see. It's not as if every judge has been bought and paid for. It's not as if the army has rolled over and has started marching through Fifth Avenue arresting people who are in cafes with laptops, right? We're pretty far from there. But is this a serious moment? Absolutely. But the worst thing you can do at this point is to take an attitude, and I'm not saying that you're the only one doing this, but you see this all the time, of somehow America got it wrong, and therefore we need to pay the price for it. It's just this, please.
I'm with you, Mark. America didn't get it wrong, and you didn't get it wrong in coming here. But there have been moments, and you've been very open about it.
I like to push you, Chris. I got to push your envelope. That's what makes it work.
Absolutely. And I'll push back just a little bit, remembering moments when you said you were looking for a small country out there in the world with a woman chief executive, and that was going to be your next best effort.
Yeah, that ended up being totally wrong, however. Because what we got was Nicola Sturgeon, who managed to blow up the SNP despite her COVID competence. And then we got Jacinda down in New Zealand, who basically locked her own population, about 10% of her own countrymen, out of the country for 15 months. And when they got back into vote, they couldn't wait to see the back of her. So, maybe I was utterly wrong on that one.
I'm glad you're still here, Mark. I'm glad you're still a star on open source. I'm also glad that we sort of agree that what he does and how the country reacts to a deportation drive is the first sort of critical test, not just of economic wisdom and whether it provides jobs that, to this point, a lot of Americans don't want to do for themselves, but also what kind of social democrats we are in the end.
Oh, yeah.
What is our process? What is our standard?
Or even if we are. I mean, I've just come to the conclusion that the Democratic Party is basically the party of the top 10% management class. They don't really want anything to change. They're willing to give fringe benefits for marginal employees, but that's pretty much it. And, that's really who they are. That's who they've been exposed as. Kamala didn't have an inability to make an economic argument. There just wasn't one. Because they're perfectly happy with the status quo.
Mark Blyth at Brown University, I know that our listeners are thrilled to hear that voice again. And let's do it soon again.
Of course. Anytime, my friend.
Great pleasure. Mark Blyth teaches the interaction of politics and money at the Watson Institute at Brown University. And he writes books for the rest of us, like Austerity, The History of a Bad Idea, and coming next year, Inflation, A Guide for Users and Losers. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, now's the time. Go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. Open Source is proud to be a member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to politics to art to technology. We come together around the principle that independent voices are more important than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. And thank you